On December 12, 1963, the East African nation of Kenya stood on the brink of a new era. After nearly 80 years of British colonial rule, the Union Jack was lowered and the black, red, and green flag of Kenya was raised high. The struggle for independence had been long and arduous, marked by the Mau Mau uprising and the relentless effort of the nationalist leaders. Jomo Kenyatta, the leader of the Kenya African National Union (KANU, was sworn in as the first Prime Minister of Kenya. His journey from a young Kikuyu boy to a revered leader had been fraught with challenges, but his vision for a free Kenya never wavered. A year after independence, Kenya transitioned from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. Jomo Kenyatta became the first president, symbolizing the unity and the strength of the new nation. Kenyatta's economic philosophy was rooted in African socialism, a blend of traditional communal values and modern economic strategies. His policies aimed at promoting self-reliance, equitable distribution of resources, and economic independence through collective ownership. Under Kenyatta's leadership, Kenya experienced substantial economic growth. Infrastructure development, education expansion, and industrialization were some of the positive outcomes of his policies. However, Kenyatta's tenure was not without controversy. His government faced accusations of corruption, ethnic favorism, and political repression. The one-party rule led to a lack of political pluralism and freedom of speech. On August 22, 1978, Kenya lost its founding father. Jomo Kenyatta passed away, leaving behind a complex legacy of both progress and challenges. The man who took over was Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. Moi was not a revolutionary. He had been Kenyatta's quiet, loyal vice president since 1967. When he assumed power, many thought he would be a weak, transitional leader, just a caretaker of the system Kenyatta had built, but they were wrong. Moi consolidated power with an iron grip, eliminating rivals, silencing critics, and turning Kenya into a de facto one-party state under the ruling party KANU. With control secured, he turned his attention to the economy. In 1980, Kenya was still largely an agricultural economy, relying on exports like coffee, tea, and tourism. But Moi wanted something bigger. He wanted to industrialize to bring Kenya into the future. His government introduced large-scale infrastructure projects, increased government spending, and borrowed heavily from the World Bank and the IMF. At first, it worked. Roads were built, schools opened, and Nairobi's skyline grew taller. But behind the scenes, cracks began to form. Moi's administration, particularly his inner circle of powerful ministers, began turning the economy into a personal playground. Some of the key figures included Nicholas Biwott, who was once the feared power broker, known as the Total Man. He controlled government contracts, intelligence, and some say even life and death. Another of his lieutenants was George Saitoti, the finance minister then, who oversaw the economy but also presided over one of the most fraudulent financial schemes in Kenya's history. Another key person was James Kanyotu, the head of intelligence, who ensured that those in power remained untouchable. Under their watch, corruption became institutionalized. The Kenyan government started handing out contracts to insiders, inflating prices, and siphoning public funds. But as the government kept spending, the economy started to bleed. By the late 1980s, Kenya was heading into an economic crisis. The country's foreign reserves were running dangerously low, and the Kenyan shilling was losing value fast. Importers struggled to buy foreign goods, and the government was desperate to bring in foreign currency to stabilize the economy. In response, Moi's government introduced a controversial policy, the Export Compensation Scheme, where exporters will be rewarded with a 30% government payout for every dollar they brought into the country. The idea was to encourage businesses to export more goods, earning foreign currency to rescue the economy. but the policy, like many before it, was soon hijacked by corruption. Enter Kamlesh Patni. Kamlesh Patni was born in 1965 in the coastal city of Mombasa, Kenya. The son of an Indian-Kenyan trader, he grew up surrounded by commerce, where the sound of counting coins was a lullaby and the language of deals was spoken fluently. While others played, he observed. While others worked, he learned. He wasn't just interested in making money, he was interested in making power bow to him. As the years passed, the boy became a man. The streets of Mombasa could not contain his ambition, so he set his sight on Nairobi, the beating heart of Kenya's economy. The young entrepreneur quickly realized that wealth wasn't just earned, it was engineered. It wasn't just about what you sold, it was about who you knew and how well you could make them listen. By the late 1980s, Kenya's economy was shifting. The government was desperate for foreign exchange, offering rewards for gold and diamond exports. But there was one problem. Kenya had no significant gold mines. Where others saw a dead end, Patni saw an opening. What if gold could appear where none existed? What if the right words whispered in the right ears could turn paper into profit? And so a plan was born. In 1990, Goldenberg International was founded, a name that would soon become synonymous with scandal. Patni presented himself as a patriotic entrepreneur with a grand vision to make Kenya a major player in the global trade. But Kenya had a problem. It barely produced any gold. The solution? A scheme so elaborate it fooled an entire nation. In 1989, Patni convinced the government to grant his two companies, the Goldenberg International and Exchange Bank Limited, both owned and directed by businessman Kamlesh Patni and his partner James Kanyotu, the Director of Intelligence in the Kenya Police Force. Kamlesh Patni promised to bring in millions of dollars in foreign currency. In return, the government paid Goldenberg 30% in cash incentives for every dollar it supposedly earned. The two were licensed by the government to export gold and diamonds from Kenya. But they did not. They just collected an inflated subsidy. That was the birth of the worst corruption scandal in Kenya's history, the Goldenberg Scandal. The Goldenberg Scandal occurred at a time of severe economic austerity in Kenya in the early 1990s. The country's economy was characterized by long periods of macroeconomic instability and dwindling foreign reserves. Economic policy was inward-looking. It leaned towards the protection of local industries and the retention of foreign exchange. This period was coincided with the one-party state that began in 1982 and was marked by political oppression. As a result, donors gradually reduced support and investment evaporated. Foreign debt payments became irregular and the government increasingly fell back on loan borrowing. The Kenyan government turned to international financial institutions for cheaper loans. These were provided, but were conditional on economic reforms, such as measures intended to stimulate trade. Coincidentally or otherwise, Goldenberg International applied to the Kenyan government in July 1990 for certain privileges that spoke directly to the economic needs of the country. The company received a monopoly on exports of gold and diamonds from Kenya. It was also given a subsidy of 35% of the value of these exports, 15% more than the official rate at that time. Goldenberg managed to defraud the Kenyan state between $600 million and $1.5 billion in subsidies. Subsidies can be direct, such as cash payments, or indirect, such as tax breaks. Goldenberg's subsidy was in monetary form, on condition that the company proved foreign exchange gains through exporting non-traditional commodities. The fraud was that Kenya had insignificant amounts of non-gold deposits and absolutely no diamonds. Government officials authorized payments for fictitious exports. The architects of the Goldenberg scandal abused a number of trade policies. This included the Export Compensation Act, which allowed exporters to be reimbursed up to 30% of the value of their exports by the government. The government believed that by rewarding exporters, more businesses would focus on international trade, bringing in much needed foreign currency. Another policy was the Pre-Shipment Finance Act, which was a government-backed financial support system that allowed exporters to access funds before shipping goods to international markets. This was meant to boost Kenya's export sector by ensuring businesses had the working capital needed for production, packaging, and logistics, and the retention of the scheme. There is inherently nothing wrong with these measures, which are intended to stimulate trade, but they were implemented in the context of a corrupt political system and became instruments of fraud. Another significant aspect of the fraud was Kenya's exchange rate system. The difference between official and parallel exchange rates and the depreciating Kenyan shilling allowed Goldenberg to earn illegal returns on foreign exchange. Check kitting is another tool that was used. It's a form of check fraud that utilizes the time it takes for a check to clear to use non-existent money in an account. Officials at the highest level of government were heavily involved in authorizing payments to Goldenberg. Under the rules to obtain subsidies, Goldenberg had to get signatories from Customs Department that exports had occurred from the Central Bank of Kenya, that revenue had arrived from the Ministry of Minerals, and that production had occurred, and from the Ministry of Finance for final authorization. As was alleged in a recent Al Jazeera expose on gold fraud in Zimbabwe, where Patni's name had featured, corrupt and well-paid government officials in Kenya played a part in the plunder of the nation during the Goldenberg years. An audit ordered by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank into check kitting and forex fraud in April 1993 sparked the unraveling of the Goldenberg Scandal. No one ever went to jail for this great fraud, despite years of inquiry and prosecution of some of the parties involved. The government of Kenya received no benefit, as there were no official export earnings from the sale of gold and diamonds. By 1993, the scam had drained the Kenyan economy over $600 million, about 10% of the entire GDP at that time. Inflation skyrocketed, foreign investors fled, and the country was on the brink of financial ruin. The truth was finally coming to light. For 24 years, Daniel Arap Moi ruled Kenya with absolute authority. Under his watch, the Goldenberg scheme had funneled billions of shillings into the hands of a small elite, while ordinary Kenyans struggled with soaring inflation and economic hardship. But by the year 2002, things were changing. After Moi stepped down, Kenya elected Mwai Kibaki, a man who promised to clean up the corruption that had gripped the nation for decades. One of his first acts as president was to do something Moi never dared: open a public inquiry into the Goldenberg scandal. In February 2003, President Mwai Kibaki established the Goldenberg Commission of Inquiry, the most comprehensive investigation into corruption in Kenya's history. Its mandate to uncover the truth behind Goldenberg International, identify those responsible, and recommend legal action. At the center of it all stood one man, Kamlesh Patni, the mastermind behind the scandal. Patni, once a shadowy figure moving behind closed doors, was now forced to testify in public. For 3 years, the government had testimony from over 100 witnesses, from former government ministers to high-ranking central bank officials, and what emerged was worse than anyone had imagined. Kamlesh Patni admitted that his company Goldenberg International had received billions of shillings in export compensation for gold and diamond that never existed. Between 1990 and 1993, Goldenberg International fraudulently claimed 13.5 billion shillings, roughly $600 million from Kenya's government. At that time, that was 10% of the entire country's GDP. The scandal was not just about gold. It exposed a system where Kenya's political elite used public institutions as tools for personal enrichment. The inquiry found that the office of the president had authorized the payments. Moi himself, while not directly named, was shown to have known about Goldenberg's activities and done nothing to stop them. After 3 years of hearings, the Goldenberg report was finally released in October 2006. It recommended that Kamlesh Patni, George Saitoti, and Nicholas Biwott face criminal prosecution. The Goldenberg inquiry exposed the depth of corruption in Kenya, but it also revealed a bitter truth. When power and money intertwine, justice becomes a distant dream. And though the scandal is decades old, its shadow still looms large over Kenya's political and economic landscape. Well, let us know what you think about this scandal in this comment section, and also share with us which other scandal stories you would like to see us document. And as always, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.